Welcome to our series, Poetry for the Soul, Part 9. There are only 12 parts, so enjoy. Poetry is about the grief. Politics is about the grievance. Robert Frost. Poetry is not an expression of the party line. It's that time of night, lying in bed, thinking what you really think, making the private world public. That's what the poet does. Allen Ginsberg. In science, one tries to tell people, in such a way as to be understood by everyone, something that no one ever knew before. But in poetry, it's the exact opposite. Paul Dirac, English theoretical physicist, 1902-1984. Poetry is the opening and closing of a door, leaving those who look through to guess about what is seen during a moment. Carl Sandburg, 1878 to 1967. Poetry often enters through the window of irrelevance, MC. Perhaps no person can be a poet, or can even enjoy poetry, without a certain unsoundness of mind. Thomas Babington Macaulay. Teach your children poetry. It opens the mind, lends grace to wisdom, and makes the heroic virtues hereditary. Sir Walter Scott. Poetry is the language of a state of crisis. Stephen Mallarmé. Poetry is the art of substantiating shadows and of lending existence to nothing. Edmund Burke. A man should hear a little music, read a little poetry, and see a fine picture every day of his life, in order that worldly cares may not obliterate the sense of the beautiful, which God has implanted in the human soul. Goethe. There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. Emily Dickinson. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, "Here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well." Martin Luther King, 1929 to 1968. Poetry is to prose as dancing is to walking. John Wayne. Sometimes the beauty is easy. Sometimes you don't have to try at all. Sometimes you can hear the wind blow in a handshake. Sometimes there's poetry written right on the bathroom wall. Annie DiFranco, an American singer, songwriter and guitarist, born 1970. We especially need imagination in science. It is not all mathematics, nor all logic, but it is somewhat beauty and poetry. Maria Montessori. Before people complain of the obscurity of modern poetry, they should first examine their consciences and ask themselves how many people and on how many occasions they have genuinely and profoundly shared some experience with another. W.H. Auden, 1907 to 1973. And I've quoted this before because it's quite humorous. There are two ways of disliking poetry. One way is to dislike it. The other is to read Pope. Oscar Wilde. I decided that it was not wisdom that enabled poets to write their poetry, but a kind of instinct or inspiration, such as you find in seers and prophets, who deliver all their sublime messages without knowing in the least what they mean. Socrates. This is from an unknown author. The essentials of poetry are rhythm, dance, and the human voice. The true spirit of delight, the exaltation, the sense of being more than man, which is the touchstone of the highest excellence, is to be found in mathematics as surely as in poetry. Bertrand Russell. Poetry is just the evidence of life. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash. Leonard Cohen. I have nothing to say, and I am saying it, and that is poetry. John Cage, the American avant-garde composer, 1912 to 1992. My poetry, I think, has become the way of my giving out what music is within me. County Cullen. Poetry is the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge. It is the impassioned expression which is in the countenance of all science. William Wordsworth. It is the job of poetry to clean up our word-clogged reality by creating silences around things. Again, unknown. I think language does bring us together, fragile and misleading as it is. It's the best communication we've got, and poetry is language at its most intense and potentially fulfilling. Poems do bring people together. Music and religion are as intimately related as poetry and love. The deepest emotions require for their civilized expression the most emotional of arts. Will Durant, American writer and historian, 1885 to 1981. Music begins to atrophy when it departs too far from the dance. Poetry begins to atrophy when it gets too far from music. Ezra Pound, 1885 to 1972. Poetry should only occupy the idle. Lord Byron. Satirical comment. Poetry and hums aren't things which you get. They're things which get you. And all you can do is go where they can find you. Winnie the Pooh. Poetry is the journal of a sea animal living on land, wanting to fly in the air. Carl Sandburg. 1878 to 1967. Poetry has been to me its own exceeding great reward. It has given me the habit of wishing to discover the good and beautiful in all that meets and surrounds me. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Dancing is the poetry of the foot. John Dryden. There is a great deal of poetry and fine sentiment in a chest of tea. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The truest poetry is the most feigning, and lovers are given to poetry, and what they swear in poetry may be said, as lovers, they do feign. William Shakespeare. I am two fools, I know, for loving and for saying so in whining poetry. John Donne. Wine is bottled poetry. Robert Louis Stevenson. Lean your body forward slightly to support the guitar against your chest. For the poetry of the music should resound in your heart. Some people go to priests, others to poetry. I to my friends. Virginia Woolf. And the last one, a verbal art, like poetry, is reflective. It stops to think. Music is immediate. It goes on to become. W. H. Auden.